Welcome to the second season of the Inquiry podcast brought to you by the Philosophy Society. Our guest today is Dr. Robert Kruckeberg, Professor of History.
Oh my god, you're really bad at this. Never mind. Welcome, Professor Kruckeberg. I hope you're enjoying yourself.
I am, thank you.
Yes. So, if you would introduce yourself, what do you do exactly?
Well, I'm a historian of early modern France, and particularly the 18th century. I work on absolutism and the Enlightenment during the 18th century, particularly kind of political ideas in the 18th century and how they're evolving and changing. And particularly, I work on the French Revolution, kind of how economics and politics at the time are becoming more radicalized and transforming. So those kind of things.
Mm-hmm. Before we get into that, a little disclaimer: make yourself really comfortable. I used to say this all the time, then I sort of forgot right now. Essentially, try to visualize this whole interaction in a very informal sense. You know, having a beer with us, cracking open a cold one, or coffee if that's what you like. I don't know. We don't have anything on the table because sort of short on money. But imagine that we've given you all these things.
I'll do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So primarily, the impetus for this podcast was that we were sort of interested in getting to know professors, their lives, and their academia, and the intersectionalities between all of them, right? And so I will be asking questions about yourself, but also your academic pursuits, and try to, discern from that tangled web, if you will.
All right.
Primarily, before the French Revolution is extremely specific. Before we get to that, why did history interest you? How did it interest you? Why would you want a career path in history?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. I first got interested in history. Actually, I was kind of a misspent youth, and certainly didn't have any kind of academic pursuits, or I was a terrible student, right? I spent most of my time getting in trouble and things like that. And I was actually a junior in high school, and I took a world history class, and it was actually the teacher was actually somebody that either had a master's degree or a PhD in history. So he was more of an academic and intellectual type. He certainly saw himself in that way. And because he had advanced degrees in history, he taught all of his classes were kind of the honors and AP classes and things like that. And he had one normal class. The only reason I had the opportunity to take him, but the class was so engaging and so lively. And he talked about history in much more of a cultural and literary and philosophical way. And it was the first time that I realized that, learning could be fun, or that pursuits of the mind were fun and engaging and things like that. And I really became interested in history from that class, and really kind of an example of how one teacher can really turn somebody's life around in a lot of ways. So I became interested in that class, and for some reason I was really drawn in particular to the French Enlightenment and ideas about the French Enlightenment and Rousseau and Voltaire and things like the philosophers of the 18th century.
So interesting that you draw a line between philosophy and history. A lot of things we do as minors in the philosophy is largely history. We just think about the history of thought and ideas.
Yeah.
And so, there's a lot of intersectionalities there. But ideally though, what are you enamored by? Are you enamored by what people do or what people think? Because as a philosophy minor and hopefully academic philosopher in the future, I sort of align myself with what people think. I don't really care about the detailed nuances of what people do. And I think there's a divide there.
Well, I certainly started out my career interested in the history of ideas, almost kind of classical intellectual history. I've since kind of changed a bit from that, but I wouldn't necessarily draw a distinction between actions and ideas. I think that ideas always drive kind of actions in a lot of ways, right? And that actions are a reflection of ideas. One of the things that I'm interested in is the way we interact with material goods, for example, changes our thoughts or transforms our thoughts, that intersection between materiality and ideas, right? So I'm not sure I would make that such a strong distinction between those two. I understand, of course, exactly what you're saying and all those things, but yeah.
I make the distinction because of primarily armchair philosophizing, where You can sit around and think about ethical frameworks and normative ethics and things like that, and they don't necessarily most of the time translate into any action apart from philosophers writing angry letters to one another. But that, it isn't action in a, I don't know, any strict sense, right? I don't have to write that angry letter. So essentially that's the pursuit of, and it does become that in the pursuit of ideas becomes a thing that philosophers do in and of itself, regardless of whether they want to apply those ideas to the real world or not.
Well, I guess the point I would make is that in some sense, right, our actions are being driven by ideas. Even if we're not conscious of those ideas, people do things all day long, all around the world, that are things that are unconscious, that meanwhile are deeply ideological, right? In other words, ideological in the sense that they're driven by ideas. I can't remember, you probably know who it is, but there was a famous philosopher or cultural anthropologist who said, what is most natural is most ideological, right? In other words, the things that we consider to be just by nature, the other day I was using an example in my class. I said, well, why, if a poor person takes something from a rich person, what is that called? Theft. That person goes to prison. That person's a criminal, right? Why? Well, it's because they have the capitalist ideology so deeply embedded in them that they just assume that person is a criminal, right? And I'm not saying proposing a socialist ideology per se, but in other words, those are ideas that are so deeply embedded in our society that everyone assumes, even to the point where when there's a hurricane, if you see somebody taking food from a grocery store, they're a looter. They might be hungry. They might be hungry. And I remember when there was the earthquake, for example, in Port-au-Prince, I remember, and of course, Port-au-Prince, 250,000 people were killed in 2009, I believe it was. I actually knew people in Port-au-Prince at the time, and I was following the events really closely. And of course, there was literally people didn't have food and water, and people are taking food and water from stores and anywhere where they can. And the American media, I remember, covered it. And they said, well, the looting has taken hold in Port-au-Prince. Well, maybe hungry people are trying to eat. But that capitalist ideology is so deeply embedded in us that even in the midst of hunger, we can't imagine it in any other ideological or intellectual framework than criminality. So, I think that the difference between ideas and actions, those ideas frame actions, even if we're not conscious of how they do it, right? And I think that maybe as a historian, I'm more focused on those actions, but I'm fundamentally interested in how are those ideas changing? How are those ideas changing that is transforming? In other words, action's a reflection of ideology, right? So maybe I'm studying more self-consciously the action, but very much aware of ideology in the background. And maybe a philosopher is more concerned about the ideas and not so much about the action. But to me, it's one of the same thing, and that is to understand human society, culture, ideas.
Given everything that you've said, what is your grounding ideology? The actions that I see are just you being a professor, you teaching classes, you sitting down to have a talk with us. But do you have one unifying ideology, or do you have a constellation of grounding ideologies? I don't know.
I'm not sure that I necessarily understand entirely what you mean by that. I mean, if you want to talk about my scholarship or things like that, I mean, certainly there are schools...
the one ideology that would be closest to you. I don't know. Like if I were to ask you that one ideology that describes you the most, if not the best, but the most.
I'm still not sure exactly what you mean. You mean like political or economic or what?
I don't know. Maybe political. See, the distinction is then you necessarily, it's about what you care about, right? I don't really care about my political ideologies as much. And so even though I house some of them, if asked what most defines me, I'm not going to espouse my political ideology because I don't really care about politics, right?
Yeah. Well, everything is political, right? Everything's political.
Maybe, but
I would take you to task on that. But to go back to your point, I'm not sure I'm completely comfortable answering that question. But I would say that what really drives me on a day-to-day basis is that I'm just fascinated by people, and that's why history to me is so fascinating, because you're not really limited by anything in history. History is everything that's happened in the past, and you can make whatever you want of it. You can make whether it be art history, the history of ideas, whether it be social or economic history, and fundamentally, I'm just interested in the ways in which different people understand the world, right? So I'm fascinated by that, and I want to constantly try to understand why is it that people saw the world in this way? What drove their action? What made them, think those things? And how is it that they saw the world in surprising ways that I never imagined? Or the most interesting thing historically is when you look back and say, how could those people have done that? How could they have thought that? Well, they thought it for a reason. Instead of maybe passing judgment on them or simply seeing them as different, let's try to understand what it is that drove them. And really, in a larger sense, I feel like that's the point of not only history but education itself, right? I mean, I always tell people that if we're talking, for example, about the history of capitalism or socialism, and talking about theft, for example, is maybe that's an ideological construction rather than some kind of independent idea. Maybe not everyone sees it that way. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's good, right? If talking about different people's sexuality makes you uncomfortable, then that's good. If talking about different religions makes you a little bit uncomfortable because of your own religious beliefs, well, that's good. I think fundamentally all education should be about taking us out of our comfort zone and making us see the way that other people see the world, the other possibilities of human self-construction. I don't remember what you asked me anymore.
Well, that's also what we're going for, right? We are shooting for having as weird as conversation as possible, and
Okay. Good.
so we're en
Good.
route now. Go all over the place. You said you'd take me to task on
I
everything
can't.
being political.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of no true Scotsman going on there. Like
A
if
lot
you
of what?
a no true Scotsman going
No
on
true
there.
Scott. What do you mean?
Well, the inverse of no true Scotsman, wherein if you're going to label every category of interaction as political, there's a lot of arbitrariness to labeling it that way. And then if you said, hey, everything is political, at that point it ceases to be useful also. That's like saying, I don't know, everything is good. Regardless of what argument I gave, if I just said no, that the ontology of that is still good somehow, then
Well,
that's not a useful conversation to have. And likewise, this distinction just seems, arbitrary, also very infalsifiable. So
I mean, perhaps, but I guess what I would say is that even the most inane kind of actions or interactions tend to be political and ideological in a way that people, again, just tend not to imagine. For example,
well, yeah, I
for-
understand that. And
I mean,
that's where Marx, etc., come in, right? In their psychoanalysis of just people, and trying to link that to politics. That is really useful, but I don't think that all interaction ever is somehow.
I mean, maybe
Yeah.
not. We can
Yeah.
probably get too far, but I was just simply saying to you that certainly there has to be some deeper political issues there, right? Because there's certainly the way you organize your life or the way you interact with people.
Sure, but
You know,
sometimes
for
sometimes
example-
I just like
example,
my apple, right?
Right. Well, sure.
Yeah.
But for example, let me give you an example. So for the audience, you're barefoot now,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So that says something about you. The fact that you're walking around campus barefoot, and you're wearing a t-shirt,
Mhm.
right? If you had come in wearing a three-piece suit and a tie and leather shoes, that probably would say something else about your the ideological way in which you see the world, right? I mean, so that's no. You're waving your head no.
Well,
I
I mean, this.
don't know. I'm not thinking it through very clearly, right? I mean, this is all off the cuff.
Sure.
But
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
my problem here is I can't really shower right now because of my foot. I don't want to remove my bandage. I can't wear shoes because of my bandage because I broke my
Yeah,
foot.
I'm not giving you a hard time about wearing the shoes.
No, yeah. No. But I'm just drawing a causal chain there.
Yeah.
There's no politics in me falling down in my room and breaking my foot. That
Sure,
led to
sure,
my
sure.
entire dress choice
But-
today.
But the way
So-
you dress still nonetheless reflects some kind of deeper ideological decisions.
Sure,
even if you may not-
sometimes yes, but not necessarily all the time. I don't know. Sometimes I just think that I just like things because I like them. There's no big ideology behind it, and there shouldn't be, because if there is all the time, then
Well,
I
again,
don't know. You can always deconstruct them.
Well, and
and-
again, I'd go back to what is most natural is most ideological, right? So,
Uh-huh.
But anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
So, Professor, in the last few days, there's been A directive given from the Trump administration to investigate the social media accounts of every immigrant, yeah. From those with green cards to naturalized citizens to those just here on a student visa.
Mhm.
The directive will cost immensely in terms of time and money to ultimately investigate what many people seem to think is a non-issue, yeah.
I had to admit, Charles, I saw the story, but I didn't actually read it. So the Trump administration is or requiring that all people here who are immigrants are having their social media monitored, right? Something along those lines.
Right, well, they go through everything you post, everything you share,
Mhm.
and scrutinize it, yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, the immigration system in America is already very arbitrary as it is, right? You don't need much to have problems thrown your way as an immigrant. And it should be noted that immigrant in this context is a very broad term, yeah?
Mm.
It, like I said, covers pretty much everyone here that wasn't born here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know anything about that specific issue. I saw that you sent me that story, and I didn't really read it except for the first paragraph and things like that. The one thing I would say is that I think that about that, and again, I completely ignorant of that particular issue. The one thing I would say is I think it just taps into a larger sense of kind of divisiveness and fear of immigrants that somehow other and not us. And I think that one of the things I can say is that this is part of a much larger issue, not only in the United States, but of course around the world. And I think Charles and I have talked about this before in my office. And that is that there's kind of this rise of xenophobia in the West, meaning Europe and North America in particular. You saw this in a lot of different ways. I mean, there are, of course, millions of what I would call refugees to Europe rather than immigrants. It's been a hot topic recently, and of course, in large part, the Brexit, the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from Europe was not only a rejection of immigrants, but also the rise of British nationalism, an affirmation of British nationalism, and something that I think too many Americans don't realize is that nationalism can be a really scary thing. I mean, most Europeans see nationalism as almost a dirty word. Why? Because it was nationalism that led to the death and misery of tens of millions of people in World War One and World War Two. I mean, children were taught in England at the beginning of the century to hate Germans, and Germans were taught to hate French, and the French school children would actually sing songs every day about the evil Huns in Germany and how they had the children of Alsace and Lorraine and things like that. And then in that context, you have Brexit. The European Union was meant to break down those nationalisms to prevent war from happening. Brexit was seen as kind of a shot across the bow. And then on top of that, you have the election of Donald Trump, who ran on this kind of anti-immigrant build the wall, right? Even though there's no practical reason to build a wall, it's not going to really do anything. Almost all illegal immigration is people who cross the border and then just don't leave. Right.
Right.
But it becomes symbolically important. It's politically important. That symbols are important. And for people who were prone to those kinds of xenophobic feelings, it worked. And in France, there was just an election last year. The Front National, no, yeah, I think it's the Front National,
Marie Le Pen, yeah.
yeah, or I forget. I want to say maybe it's the Front Populaire actually, or something like that. I forget the title they use. The extreme right wing party, a quasi fascist party. They run largely on anti-immigration, French nationalism, anti-EU. They received something like 35% of the vote, which is shocking. But 1 out of 3 people in France voted for what everyone else in the country considers an extreme right wing party. That's kind of code for a quasi fascist party. In Germany, we just had elections over the weekend. For the first time, the extreme right wing party in Germany is going to have 13% of the seats in the Bundestag. So, as far as that monitoring social media and things, I think the more disconcerting thing is this larger sense of us versus them, this fear of other people, that somehow our identity and culture is superior, rather than maybe monitoring immigrants as scary people who are somehow going to subvert our culture and identity. Maybe we should learn their language.
Right.
Maybe we should learn their language, understand their ideas, their culture, rather than fear them. I think the thing that generally has made the United States the greatest country in the world, I think, is that we have literally tens of millions of people every year from around the world that would like to come here. Why? Because the United States is an amazing place for all of its flaws and everything else. And yet the Troy University this last year has had, for the first time in 15 or 18 years, has had a drop in the number of international students, new international students coming by something like 250 students. Why? Well, it's called the Trump effect. That's what people are calling it. People from around the world are now iffy about coming here. They're not sure if they'll be able to get visas. They're not sure if they want to be here after all the divisive rhetoric, political rhetoric, and things like that. These people are now going to Canada and Australia, right? It's been a huge boon for them and their educational system, their societies, money flowing in and things like that. It's also been sad to see that we're going to be a less diverse society, that people are not want to come in. So the thing I would say about that is I think that's more about fear mongering. It's more about an irrational fear rather than, and this is why, again, I think history is so important. I think what's more important is to spend our time trying to understand people and not fear them.
Do you not think that there are what's happening now in the world, that there are elements to this correlates of things that are happening now, rise in nationalism, etc. in the past too? Hasn't there always been the case that sometimes there will be a staunch rise in nationalism, and then people revolt against that once that gets too hard to handle? But
Sure,
isn't it-
sure. It's just a matter of what the cost is.
Yeah.
In Europe, 50 million people were dead before it turned the tide, right? So I mean, I think that's the thing that and kind of like the what's going on with the NFL and the athletes and the kneeling on the flag. I mean, again, I suspect that the vast majority, probably 95+% of Americans, stand and say the national anthem at the beginning of an athletic event without thinking anything of it. It's simply a subconscious act that everyone else does it. It's a collective recognition of our political identity or of our even political ideology. And you can see how strong of an ideological statement it is, because when you see a professional athlete go down on one knee, and it's very upsetting to a lot of people. But it's also an act of nationalism, right? I mean, most people, at least in Europe, generally consider the flag. The flag is something you see in public buildings, right? It's not something you see in a private home. It's certainly not something that you kind of worship almost as this iconic level. Why? Because that reeks of nationalism. And that's something that I think is a kind of really a cultural distinction between Americans and certainly Europeans and things like that. So I can't remember again what you asked, but
Well, I mean, I asked about just patterns in history where this has
that
happened in the
influence,
past. But I mean, there are elements of nationalism in India as well. With Modi becoming the prime minister now, etc. But India has always been nationalistic, though, for the past 70 years, ever since its inception. And you sort of have to be, otherwise, how would they have united so many disparate cultures into one group? So they needed the idea of nationalism to have a nation in the first place. When the British left, there were 25, 28 princely states, each autonomous on their own. I mean, I'd say it was a good thing that they all united, right?
But you also see the problems, and I really know much about India at all. I'm afraid to say, but you also see the problems of nationalism in India as well.
Well, sure. I mean, we'll always have problems, though.
Is a good Indian Muslim, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, there's a lot of problems with that idea of nationalism too.
Well, sure, but I don't disagree with that. But we will always have problems, no matter what the idea is. Do you not think that's the case? Like we seem, the only thing us humans as a species seem to be good at is to come up with problems all the time. Right? Whenever we give you a solution, I'll have 10 more new problems based on that solution. So I don't know. I don't think that the European model of just dislike toward nationalism or just dispassion toward nationalism, I don't see how that is superior to whatever might be happening elsewhere.
Well, again, the thing I would say is that the most important thing is to have a sense of cooperation, of understanding, and working with other people. Again, that's why the EU was originally founded, to try to create cooperation and understanding between people. And again, I don't know the situations like in India or the Indian subcontinent very well and things like that, but I do think that this kind of fear of immigrants or other is not a particularly healthy thing for an open and free society in which you can debate religions. I mean, we just elected Roy Moore or the Republican primary here in Alabama, right? And this is somebody who has quite literally said that religious belief should trump the law, which is a pretty amazing comment to make, right? I mean, that's pretty startling if you want to live in a free society, a secular society in which all religions are tolerated and accepted, right? No one's saying anything else. And other than that, and Barack Obama made a comment a few years ago that religious freedom means the tolerance for you to practice your own religion, not to force it upon somebody else. And I think that's about right. So I think we need to live in a society in which everyone is open to other people and accepting of those things. I think those, monitoring immigrants, Facebook posts and Twitter and things like that is probably not the right way to go about it. And of course, in Europe, there's been a lot of debate about this. I mean, Hungary literally has built a wall around itself. So, and in Spain, I mean, look at Spain. We're about to have a referendum in Spain, in Catalonia, where they're going to vote. It's
To secede?
well, yeah, whether or not they should be a separate country. That's October 1st, I believe, is the date for that vote. Now, it's not an official vote because the people that in Catalonia that are organizing it, the people in Madrid, the Spanish government is saying it's illegal, it's not binding. So it's probably not going to lead to anything, and it's unlikely I suspect that it'll even get 50% to secede. But what about Scotland? I mean, Scotland has been voted just a couple of years ago to barely stay in the
51-49 or something.
to the United Kingdom, and then of course Brexit happened, and the people in Scotland said, "Well, we want to stay in Europe. We barely want to be part of you anyway, right?" So I mean, where does it end? Instead of looking for ways to divide ourselves, I think we probably would be better off. I mean, look at Americans, right? I mean, in India, how many languages does the average person speak in India?
Well, at least two.
At least two,
Yeah,
right?
but northern India, they speak a lot more languages. It depends.
Probably
like,
2, 3.
at least two.
At
Yeah.
least two.
Yeah.
I mean, I have two Danish students I just found in my class this semester. The one speaks, everyone in Denmark pretty much speaks English and Danish, and then they learn a third language, which is either French or German. Both of them speak fluent, French. The one speaks fluent French, the other one speaks fluent German. The point is, they speak 3 different languages. English is basically the equivalent of a native language for them, and then they speak very good French, and then the other one speaks very good German. The average American speaks English, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is, in learning a language, there's so much more to it. Not only is it linguistically interested in all of that, but I'm trying to get Charles to learn French. But it's also learning another culture, to be able to sit down and listen to a newscast, or to listen to a documentary or a discussion, to sit down and read something online that somebody's written in another language, and to open yourself up to another culture, even if it's a Denmark, which is fairly similar culture, generally speaking, they nonetheless are going to have different ways of seeing things, of talking to things. I think that's an enriching experience, So rather than monitoring people's Facebook posts, I think that, is what I would say.
I mean, I noticed how you said you'd insisted on Charles learning French, and your specialization is the French Revolution. Why are you so enamored by the French or the French Revolution? Why did you choose to specialize in that?
Okay, well,
I'm assuming it was a choice.
Well, yeah. First of all, I want to say that Charles is the one that mentioned he had been working on French. So
okay.
I was just encouraging him.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't me trying to push my own interest on him.
Uh-huh.
The reason I actually got interested in the French history, well, I'd been interested in the Enlightenment. I'd always been interested in kind of Voltaire and the French Enlightenment since high school, when I had that very good, very talented world history teacher. Actually,
not Rousseau, just Voltaire.
Yeah, it was Voltaire, and I misspoke. Actually, I got interested in Rousseau when I took a political theory class. I was a political science major along with a history major, but almost all the classes I took in political science, I quickly found out that I hated political science. I always thought they could figure out a calculation to understand human beings, and they're almost always wrong.
They're not a science.
But they think they are. They think they are, right? And I won't beat up on political science, but I love the political theory class. And there were 2 professors there, and the one guy actually had his PhD from the University of Chicago, which is famous for their Committee on Social Thought. Alan Bloom, who had done a lot of different work, and is kind of a famous public intellectual in the United States, a philosopher and things like that. He was actually his advisor. And so he essentially taught the political theory classes as a philosophy class, but political philosophy. And we read in there Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discourse on the Arts and Sciences. It's a very short text. It's only 25 pages, but he completely kind of, here I am as a young man, 19 years old or whatever. I'm optimistic about the world. I thought everything's getting better. Voltaire, progress, all of that. And Rousseau just completely squashed that. He said, no, everything's getting worse. The more education we have, the worse we are, and things like that. So it really kind of got me interested in Rousseau. I was like, wow, what is this? And I had to say, I kind of like the idea of living in some kind of remote cabin in the middle of the woods, in the middle of nowhere, and just reading books all day. And that's kind of what I always imagined with Rousseau. So
You're not far off. You are in Troy University. So.
Yeah, exactly. So from that, I was kind of interested in Rousseau, and then I wanted to know more. I started wanting to know more about the context in which he lived to understand those ideas and things like that. So that's how I kind of got interested in 18th century France. And of course, Rousseau is somebody that's really influential for the French Revolution. This is somewhat debated among scholars, but they kind of see Rousseau in his ideas of radical democracy, that everyone is equal except for women. Everyone's equal except for women. And that idea kind of plays into the French Revolution.
Throughout your academic career in studying academia, what do you think was the one ideology or one idea that inspired you the most, or you were most interested in?
Yeah, Rousseau. I think Rousseau is, he's the thing that really, and I still love Rousseau. Even though he's probably the greatest misogynist in human history.
And also a pessimist.
A pessimist and all of those things. And his ideology about gender really shaped the 19th century idea that women should stay at home. That's really attributable to Rousseau. It's during the French Revolution when they had these new ideas that everyone's equal and everyone's a citizen. Well, then the question is, who's a citizen? Is it slaves? Is it women? And they have to actually define who is a citizen for the first time. The women are then excluded because of Rousseau's idea. And yet I have to say, I still find Rousseau's writing fascinating. I still find it is equally enthralling and is fun to read. He redid so much in Western civilization and Western thought. Just the modern autobiography is influenced by him. He wrote his Confessions, mimicking St. Augustine's Confessions of the, around 400 or something, right? Except instead of confessing his sins in his pre-Christian life, as St. Augustine does, Rousseau just gives everything. He says everything about me is the way I am and has shaped me, and it's authentic and therefore is good. So what does he do? Well, he tells the stories about his first sexual encounters. He tells the stories of his first memory of an erection, which happened to be when his nanny threw him over her lap to spank him. Who talks about those things, right?
That's
Rousseau.
Freud.
Rousseau. Well, but this is before Freud, right? This is Rousseau in the
Yeah.
18th century talking about these things. He talks about how he abandoned all of his children to the orphanage, which is a death sentence in the 18th century. But, he makes it about an autobiography about revealing your own internal
Mental
affectivity,
states,
emotionality, whatever, without any sense of shame. And he probably should be ashamed of some of those things. But so even the Confessions, or I could go on and on, no matter what it is about Rousseau, if I pick up one of his texts, I find it still just eminently readable, fascinating, and perhaps in a little bit of a depraved kind of way, but I still just find him absolutely fascinating. So even though I feel a little bit guilty about enjoying reading Rousseau, again, one of the horrible misogynists of his time, but
Well, I have read Mein Kampf, so I guess we're sort
yeah,
of.
Mein Kampf is actually really
Yeah.
interesting. I signed that in my classes for Western Civ. I think it's a fascinating text in a bizarre way, but it's important.
He was much more deplorable than Rousseau. So if we can read Mein Kampf, then
right.
sure, we can read
Mein
Rousseau.
Kampf,
Yeah.
But again, it's important because just like trying to understand Rousseau, one of the reasons why I like to assign Mein Kampf is because students often think of Hitler as, this goes back to the immigration and xenophobia. People think of Hitler as this crazy man. He's not a crazy man. He represented an ideology. Millions upon millions of people agreed with him. There were people in the United States who agreed with his ideology. Potentially the King of England at the time, before he abdicated, seems to have been sympathetic to Hitler. And you can see that in Mein Kampf. It kind of makes sense. There's a certain logic. There's an ideology behind his thought. He wasn't just some crazy lunatic. He had ideas that were consistent in their application, even if it was deplorable.